Surely I can't be the only one who finds it incredible that an entire human being can come out of such a small opening on a woman's body and cause no damage. No, seriously, before I got clued up, I honestly thought it was impossible to push an entire baby out and not end up needing stitches or, tearing. And the thought of it sent shivers down my spine. Come to find out that there is an entire world of women out there who are giving birth multiple times and never requiring stitches, never having any tears, because of a few simple things that I'm going to be talking about on this episode of the Birthing Blissfully Podcast. You ready for the new season? Let's get into it.
Ever get the sense that having a baby is like a crazy roller coaster ride where you have to brace yourself for the worst and hope for the best? Well, it doesn't have to be. Get the scoop right here on Birthing Blissfully with Ibiene Warmann.
So I remember back in the day when X was still called Twitter, I was just happily scrolling down my timeline and I stumbled on a tweet by the younger sister of a friend of mine. And she was telling the story of how she gave birth and she ended up with 4th-degree tears. Now, when you read something and it just makes you want to instantly vow that I am never putting myself through that. I was shook. If you're brand new to the Birthing Blissfully podcast, so you've probably never heard my story before, and you don't know how I used to be super terrified at the thoughts of giving birth. Like back in the day, I just heard so many crazy stories, and there just seemed to be a million and one things that could go wrong when people gave birth, and often went wrong. I don't know about you, but I don't like suffering, okay? Maybe I'll tell my story again on a future episode because there's so many new listeners. And so it can help you to understand a bit better where I'm coming from and why I care so much that other women get a chance to have safer, more pleasant birth experiences. But on this subject of vaginal births and tearing badly and requiring stitches and all of that, I happened to give birth twice and not require any stitches. Like I had no tears, no stitching. In fact, there was literally no needles in my body at all, which is something that I always thought was impossible. And what made it possible, when you boil it down to its simplest terms, was just information. It was just some information that I came into, a bunch of things that I didn't know or understand at the time when I used to be scared of childbirth, that I came to understand and I put into practice, which completely changed the game for me. I've since realized that there are many other bits of information like that if every woman who intends to give birth could just be told these things, they could make a world of difference. Like you could make your experience of childbirth very different for them. And I mean that in a positive way. Of course, if you take action on the information, because it's one thing to find out information, but if you don't act on it, then you can't obviously benefit from it. But so this series that I'm opening the new season of the Birthing Blissfully podcast with, the What I Wish I'd Known About Childbirth series, that's what it's born out of. It's me wanting to share a few of these things that I just wish I'd known back when I was scared of childbirth, that I found very helpful when I finally started having my babies, and that I know will be super helpful for anybody else who doesn't yet know these things. So go ahead and hit the subscribe button right now, because this is going to be a great series. I'm telling you, this series is going to be fire, because I'm going to be sharing so many things, so many helpful things that I didn't know back when I was scared of childbirth, that made a huge difference for me when I finally started to have my babies. So now, question time. I have a question for you. Out of every 10 births, and this is as stated on the NHS UK website, by the way, out of every 10 first-time moms who have a vaginal birth, how many of them do you think end up with some sort of tear or some sort of cut? How many do you think that number is out of 10? Okay, I'll tell you. The number is 9. 9 out of 10 first-time vaginal births end up with some sort of tear or some sort of cut. That's 90%. 90% and 90% rate according to the NHS UK website. And apparently around 5% actually end up with more serious 3rd degree or 4th degree tears. But fear not, because this is the whole point of this episode, right? I want to talk about some of the ways in which you can position yourself to end up in that 10%. And I just thought the statistic was worth knowing. But let me give you some sort of context around what I'm about to share, some of the stuff that I wish I'd known. Let me explain a bit about the point at which most people tend to experience tearing during childbirth. A lot of the time, the bad tearing tends to happen during childbirth at the point at which the baby's head is emerging. And there's an entire skull in there trying to make its way out of a smallish opening. So it makes sense, right? It makes sense that, you can end up with a really bad gash at that point. But here's a fact that I didn't know back then when I was scared of childbirth. The human body is so intelligently designed. The whole process of giving birth to a child is such an intricate process that, do you know that when babies are born, the bones that make up the skull are not actually fully fused together? I mean, I didn't know this. You might know this, but I didn't know this back in the day. The bones in the baby's skull don't actually fuse together until the baby's been born. So babies are born with two soft spots on their head called the fontanelle. You might be familiar with the fact that babies have soft spots on their head, but the bones in the skull are not fully fused together at the point of birth. And what that means is there's a degree of flexibility that's allowed by the skull of a baby when they're being born. Now, why is that useful for you to know? Well, based on that knowledge, two things. The first is that at least you can appreciate the fact that what you're pushing out is not a fully formed skull as you might have thought, right? There's a level of flexibility involved. And the other thing is that based on that design, there are pushing techniques that you can learn, like pushing techniques that people who have understood this design, taking this into account, they're pushing techniques you can learn from them to birth the baby's head more carefully than normally happens, which can save you from sustaining a tear. So let me paint a picture for you of what normally happens. And this is the natural inclination of a woman in labor, because going through labor is tasking, okay? So usually by the time that the baby's head is about to emerge, the woman has been at this whole labor thing for a while and she is ready to be done with it. So oftentimes you'll have somebody in the room say something like, "I can see the baby's head." And this is supposed to be an encouragement that she's almost at the end of the journey. But for most women giving birth, the tendency is that when you hear that, you just want to go for the next push with all your might. And that is the very point at which you're most at risk of sustaining a tear. And consequently, that's the point at which you need to be most intentional about how you push. But that doesn't tend to happen because the women at that point are like super tired and they feel like they just want to get to the end of it. And they don't necessarily understand the damage that they can cause by pushing, like in an uncontrolled way at that point. So understanding this and learning the right pushing techniques for this stage of labor is a game changer. And if you really care about reducing the risk of tearing, there are other factors as well that can help. The position you give birth in is one of them. Some birthing positions are more beneficial than others for preventing bad tearing. But before I go into that, there are various degrees of tears that a woman can sustain, right? So there's a first degree tear, there's a second degree, and I think it goes all the way up to fourth degree. I mean, as far as I'm aware. With a first degree tear, during the healing process, it's a slight tear. And during the healing process, you might experience a bit of stinging when you go to use the loo. With second degree tears, it's a bit more severe. You'll definitely require some stitches. But beyond that, when we start to talk about third degree, fourth degree tears, those are real incidents, yeah? And they are TBA, to be avoided. And yes, I just made that up. I just made that acronym up because seriously, nobody wants that. So coming back to the factors that can help. The first one's obviously learning some pushing techniques, like I mentioned, and then birthing positions, like I mentioned. Some birthing positions will put you in a better position. And I can tell you straight away that lying on your back, as is traditionally done, is not one of them. That is not one of the positions that can help you prevent really, really bad tearing. But for some reason, it's still the most popular, the most common position that women give birth in. But I digress. In fact, maybe I'll do an entire episode on birthing positions, like the good, the bad, and the ugly. So if that's something that will be of interest to you, just leave me a comment below and I will factor in if there's enough interest and people want to actually hear about birthing positions. If that'll be of interest to people, then I'll go ahead and I'll make an episode on that. So I gave birth on my knees both times because that's proven to be one of the most beneficial positions. There are other positions, but essentially, the point I'm trying to make here is that the position you give birth in can play a part in the risk of tearing, and definitely in the risk of tearing really badly. Another factor is your birth team. So the birth team that you end up with can make a huge difference because if they're nice and if your specific circumstances allow, then there are instances where a midwife or a doctor can apply a bit of pressure to the perineum to prevent it from like tearing really badly. So your birth team is a factor, birthing positions is a factor, and the pushing techniques that you understand are another factor. Now, I feel like this episode is getting a bit drawn out because I really want this series to be like bite-sized episodes that you can just get through really easily, but stay with me. Other factors that can play into the risk of tearing are things like whether you've had an epidural or not, because you're just less likely to be able to maintain control over what's going on down there if you can't feel anything. That's just a fact of the matter. So if you opt to go for an epidural, then you probably aren't going to be able to manage or control very well what's going on down there. You might be able to with the help of a midwife, but those are you just have to weigh up what is more important to you. You just have to weigh up what's important to you in terms of whether it's reducing the risk of tearing. That might just not be high on your list of priorities, which is fair enough. But these are some of the factors that can play into whether or not you tear and how badly you tear. Now, something else I wanted to touch on is water births. Sometimes people ask the question about water births, like, can this help in terms of reducing the chances of tearing? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. There is no evidence to show that simply by being in water, you can kind of like reduce the chances of sustaining a bad tear. Now, being in water has its advantages, but preventing you from tearing is not one of them. I hope that helps if that's something that you are wondering about, because I know a few people wonder about that. The next factor that I want to talk about is nutrition. Nutrition is a big factor in all things to do with pregnancy and childbirth. Like, I can't stress enough how important pregnancy nutrition is. It's way more important than a lot of us realize, because the same way that nutrition can affect your hair, nutrition can affect your skin. Basically, how they say you are what you eat? Nutrition can affect just the health and the elasticity of everything, including your birthing parts, right? So a good pregnancy-focused nutrition plan is highly recommended and can play a part in what happens to you at the point of childbirth. Some people swear by perineal massages. I came across that when I was pregnant, but I personally could not quite wrap my head around the concept. So I never tried it. And thankfully, I didn't have to. So between things like learning pushing techniques, learning some stretches, my pregnancy nutrition, I was fine both times. Both times I had no tearing and no stitches, and I never actually did like a perineal massage. But fair play. I mean, people swear by them. That is something that I understand is a factor and can help reduce the chances of you tearing, or even if you tear, reduce the chances of you having a really bad tear. Another thing that tends to come up is the size of your baby. Yes, of course, that comes up quite a bit in conversations about tearing. But remember what I said about the point at which most tearing tends to happen. It's not really to do with the weight of your baby in general. It's often to do with the point at which your baby's head emerges, right? In fact, let me just say this, like going back to the design of the female body and the whole birthing process, how you push is so much more important and plays a much bigger role on whether you sustain a bad tear or not than the weight of your baby. So just because your baby is heavier, it doesn't automatically mean that you're more likely to tear. If you understand pushing techniques, then you're actually in a position to still do as well, because remember, the bones in the baby's head are not fused together yet. So there's a level of flexibility there, even if it's a heavier baby, okay? If you take time out to survey mothers with heavier babies and mothers with average weight babies, you'll find out that there's just as many of them with tears and stitches in both categories, because technique plays a bigger part than the actual weight of the baby. Does this make some sense? Okay, now listen, the ability of the female body to stretch during pregnancy and childbirth is amazing. There's just so much stretching and growing that goes on. The tummy stretches to accommodate like an entire human being. And like when your contractions start, your cervix starts to dilate until it gets all the way to 10 centimeters. You see that ability to stretch, that elasticity, it carries over to other parts of the body as well. And the whole perineum vaginal area is not exempted. So there's just the possibility and the ability for your vaginal area to stretch to accommodate your baby without sustaining any tears. But the thing is, if you give birth too quickly, it can be a risk factor. So think slow and controlled birth, especially at the point at which you're giving birth to the baby's head. And you're more likely to avoid having like a bad tear or needing stitches. However, the chances of achieving that are very slim if you don't prepare yourself or if you don't know what to do. So this isn't the kind of information that's like, oh yeah, I heard that, right? So I know it. You're going to need to kind of learn something to, learn some things and appreciate pushing techniques and other things that you can actually put into action to get better results. Does this make some sense? So if you've been feeling concerned or a bit apprehensive about sustaining tears, or like, how people say, oh, I tore, like I had a 4th degree tear, don't even worry about it. Don't even worry about it. It's possible to give birth vaginally and not require any stitches. There are skills you can learn. There are things you can practice that can position you for a tear-free birth experience. Now, I wish I'd known that back when I was scared. I wouldn't have wasted all of that time on fear. But between the right pushing techniques, between that and nutrition, pregnancy stretches, exercises, and a handful of other factors, it's doable. I did it twice. And I have a lot of clients who've managed to do the same thing. So be encouraged, okay? And while you're still here, go ahead and hit the subscribe button right now so that you don't miss any of the other episodes in this series. And I think you should also send this to all of your pregnant friends, okay? I think that's a fantastic idea. So, all right, take care now, and I will talk to you soon.